This is the International Space Station. 20 years ago, 15 countries were involved with the creation of this outpost, which became a symbol of international cooperation. But now, that cooperation is in danger.
There's a column of main battle tanks that are coming to here.
Russia now seems prepared to bombard cities into submission.
But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the end of the Second World War, when the Nazis launched the first real missile. The first V-2 rocket killed 3 people and injured 22, thanks to the ton of explosives inside. Over the next year and a half, another 1,300 rockets would be launched at Britain, and because the technology was so new, there was nearly no counter. Thankfully, the rockets came too late in the war for it to stop the Allied push to defeat the Nazis. After the war, the United States and the then Soviet Union recruited many German scientists, including the creator of the V-2. Thanks to the work of the Germans and earlier scientists, the Americans and the Soviets both began advancing their rocket technology. Space became an essential part of the Cold War, with both countries trying to get the upper hand in the arms race, and the Americans were losing. The Soviets launched the first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. Less than a month later, they launched the first animal into space. The Americans were caught completely off guard. They worried if there was a Soviet satellite in space, it could spy on Americans or even attack the US. The Americans' scramble to launch their own satellite into space is considered by many to be the start of the space race. Only 2 months after Sputnik, the Americans launched their own satellite, the Vanguard TV3. But it only launched 2 feet. Remember, the Vanguard launch was rushed heavily in response to Sputnik, leading to a fatal mistake. This didn't stop the Americans from trying again only a month later with the launch of the satellite Explorer 1. The rocket didn't crash, and the US joined the Satellites in Space Club. Around this time, a shift begins to occur with rocket technology. Previously, space in the US was run by the US Air Force, who would primarily use the rockets for, well, the US Air Force. So, in 1958, Congress established NASA to oversee space projects and the design of spacecraft. The Soviets beat the newly formed NASA in sending the first man to space, but less than a month later, NASA launched the first man from America to space. Over the next 7 years, each country launched missions to try to one-up each other, both preparing for eventual moon landings. NASA's program to the moon was called Apollo. It was almost immediately canceled when 3 astronauts were killed in a fire on Apollo 1. It was a grim reminder of the dangers of spaceflight. In all, 31 people have died from American space programs. Their sacrifice would continually call into question if space exploration should even be attempted. After the Apollo 1 fire, 2 more Apollo missions were launched the next year, the second of which took astronauts around the moon. And thanks to the work of the same German scientists who created the V-2 missile, the stage was set for an American moon landing. After another 2 missions that were used to double-check the equipment, on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 was launched. NASA won this space race by being the first to land a man on the moon. But what were the Soviets doing? While Apollo 11 was in orbit, there was another Soviet probe with the mission name Luna 15. Its plan was to land around the same time as the Americans. And after Neil Armstrong had already walked on the moon, Luna 15 came down and crashed into a lunar mountain. The Soviets would never say anything about a failed moon landing. In fact, until 1989, they didn't even admit they were trying to get to the moon. The Soviet Union would dissolve in 1991, fracturing into 15 different countries. The biggest former Soviet country, Russia, immediately went into space development. But unlike its Soviet predecessors, Russia was willing to be cooperative. In 1998, Roscosmos and 4 other space agencies came together to create the ISS. But it wasn't really international. Of the 251 people from 19 different countries who have been to the station, the vast majority are NASA and Russian astronauts. And even though NASA has done much more for the ISS, Russia added an entire section to the station. In 2011, when NASA ended its space shuttle program, Russian rockets launched Americans to the ISS, and Russian rockets are used by American companies, including Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Russia's space program had been successful, with plans for a Mars rover and a moon base with China. And then, since Putin's invasion, much of the world has cut ties with Russia, and the politics extend into space. The head of Roscosmos responded to the sanctions by threatening to drop the space station from the sky and onto Western countries. The station's orbit must be adjusted every few hours, and that operating system is controlled by Russia. In theory, Russia could bring the station down to Earth's surface, although most of the ISS would burn up. NASA has continued to stay calm, at least publicly, and most experts agree that Russia probably won't crash the biggest man-made object in space. What is much more likely is that Russia will stop their involvement with the ISS because of the Western sanctions. Russia is also blocking the selling of their rocket engines to the United States, refusing to launch a company's satellites because it has ties to the British government, and the joint rover planned with the European Space Agency is in jeopardy. Now, in a number of weeks, Roscosmos has lost all of its ties to the West. So what will they do now? While no one really knows, the future of Russia's space program will probably be tied to China. It's worth noting that an American law prevents NASA from working with China in space. This hasn't stopped the Chinese from also becoming a space power. They have their own space station and even a Mars rover. Russia and China have plans to go to the moon together, send a robot to an asteroid, and by 2030, build a base on the moon. And since China was one of the 35 countries to abstain from condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's safe to say that China will continue to cooperate with Russian astronauts. Assuming Russia and China do work together despite the invasion, NASA may be fine. Though they are losing cooperation from one of the biggest space powers, the Russia-sized gap will likely be filled by American space companies. These private companies teaming up with Western governments could play a big role in the next space race, one that may have just begun.